and recognizing the implications of how this kind of shift from a self-defense posture that Japan has had constitutionally to a more offensive posture could result in escalation. And given the history, we need to acknowledge what the ramifications could be to our own security interests. And that's something that I am looking forward to being able to provide to all of you and to the President, if confirmed as Director of National Intelligence, is that in-depth analysis and assessment so that various policies or actions that you all or the President are considering are fully thought through, given that broader context of nuance of history and the complexities that exist within the Asia-Pacific region. Having grown up there, I'm very familiar with.
But you do
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Gabbard, when Russia was denying Assad's use of chemical weapons, they accused the U.S. of supporting terrorists. This is a line that Putin used frequently during the Syrian civil war as he supported Assad. Syrian officials made similar comments. They did it repeatedly. They did it in public. They did it at the United Nations. In 2016, you gave an interview in which you said, and this is a quote, "The U.S. is providing direct and indirect support to terrorist groups in order to overthrow the Syrian government." And in 2019, on the Democratic presidential debate stage, you said of President Trump, this is a quote, "This current president is continuing to betray us. We were supposed to be going after al-Qaeda, but over years now, not only have we not gone after al-Qaeda, our president is supporting al-Qaeda." So I'm interested to hear, what was your goal in saying these things? And did you consider, before saying them, the motives of Iran and Russia, what their motives might have been before making these claims?
Senator, as someone who enlisted in the military specifically because of al-Qaeda's terrorist attack on 9/11 and committing myself and my life to doing what I could to defeat these terrorists, it was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East. DoD train and equip program, again, begun under President Obama, is widely been known, looked at, and studied, that ultimately resulted in over $500 million being used to train who they called moderate rebels, but were actually fighters working with and aligned with al-Qaeda's affiliate on the ground in Syria, all to move forward with their regime change and not acknowledging what was obvious at the time and what has unfortunately borne true, which was that a regime change war in Syria, much like the regime change wars in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi and Mubarak, while these are all dictators, would likely result in the rise of Islamist extremists like al-Qaeda taking power. I shed no tears for the fall of the Assad regime, but today we have an Islamist extremist who is now in charge of Syria, as I said, who danced on the streets to celebrate the 9/11 attack, who ruled over Idlib with an Islamist extremist governance, and who has already begun to persecute and kill and arrest religious minorities like Christians in Syria.
I understand.
Why that should be acceptable to anyone is beyond me.
It shouldn't be.
Certainly
and
not
I understand,
in our
and I appreciate your answer, and thank you. My concern has to do with the tendency to repeat Russian and Syrian, and even in some cases, I think we'll get into in the closed session, Iranian information, and to discount what comes from our intelligence community.
Senator, every American deserves to know that people in our own government were providing support to our sworn enemy, al-Qaeda. That should not be acceptable by anyone.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Ms. Gabbard. In conclusion, Senator Warner.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know,
one of the things I love about this committee, and I know folks who are here from Ms. Gabbard may not fully realize, but this has always been a bipartisan committee. And my friend Richard Burr, who said we always kind of followed the truth. One of the things I was always proud of in the very challenging Russia investigation was, people would come in, they didn't know whether the staffer was a Democrat or Republican because we were all looking out for the same thing. Ms. Gabbard, I support and commend you for your service. But we have heard this morning taking some individuals' advice on chemical attacks, not taking American intelligence community that, as we subsequently discovered, had iffy ties, not enough due diligence. We've heard this morning on your trip to Lebanon that you weren't fully aware that the folks who originally paid for the trip had these relations and ties to this Syrian party. I know I've asked you, and I understand on the trip that you said you met with Shia religious figures and you didn't know who were there, who they were. I can understand that, although I can't imagine Shia religious figures that in the Bekaa Valley that didn't have ties to Hezbollah. And we can have a difference of opinion on TikTok. Chairman and I feel very strongly that it is a national security threat. On 702, I'm candidly confused. I thought you answered Senator Wyden you're in favor of a warrant. Senator Cornyn, I'm thought you backed off of that. And then on Edward Snowden, you won't back off of Brave. You won't back off of your legislation. You won't call him a traitor. And I think again about this is being watched by our allies around the world. I think even RT's been tweeting about it today, blasting me. And the men and women of the intelligence community. I don't know how they're going to have confidence that if under your leadership, if somebody else stepped out, that you wouldn't take the same position that you've not walked away from on Mr. Snowden. So I guess my last question, this is one I think was in some of the press, and I believe you and your husband took a trip to Rome last summer. And I'm not talking about the conference. I think you didn't ask who paid for the trip. I just want to get this off the record right now. Not if you and your husband reimbursed, but did you pay for the trip in the outset, or?
There was a
made the booking?
nonprofit organization that was coordinating with the Vatican to set up this meeting that was centered around peace and security interests in the Western
I'm not going
Hemisphere
to go into.
that
I
paid
just
for
want
the
to just
trip.
make sure. So you didn't understand your trip was paid for by a gentleman named Pierre Louvarier and the Clementi Foundation.
The nonprofit,
Okay,
my
I just say
understanding,
this-
was
there is
paid
extensive records.
for the trip.
Mr. Louvarier has enormous ties to Konstantin Malovov. I'm mispronouncing his name, but who is somebody that America has sanctioned. I'm sure we can get into this in the classified hearing, but again, the due diligence that's required before you take these trips or make these assumptions is something that I find very troubling. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warner. I would also note that same New York Times story reported there's no indication that Ms. Gabbard did anything wrong on that trip. Ms. Gabbard, thank you for your time and for your testimony. Thank you, most importantly, for your service to our nation. As I said at the outset, it's no secret that this nomination has generated more attention and interest than most nominees before this committee. We have received a large number of statements, letters, and other such materials in support of and in opposition to Ms. Gabbard's nomination. I will submit all of those for the record. For the benefit of senators, it is also my intention to hold a committee vote on Ms. Gabbard's nomination as soon as possible. Therefore, for planning purposes, any senator who wishes to submit questions for the record after today's hearing, please do so by close of business tomorrow. That is Friday, January 31st, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, let me explain what will happen next. Committee security and Mrs. Gabbard's security will escort her and her immediate party out of this room through the door behind me. Everyone else will remain seated in this room. The Capitol Police will secure that door so no one else leaves this room until Ms. Gabbard has reached her break room in preparation for the closed session. We will convene in that closed session in approximately 30 minutes at 1:10 p.m. This open session is adjourned.
Let's all see. Woo! Ohana.
Earlier today, former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee on her nomination to be the next Director of National Intelligence. You can watch the full confirmation hearing tonight starting at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN 2. It's also available to watch on the free
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Before we get underway today, I'd like to take a brief moment to recognize the terrible loss of life that occurred just a few miles away from here last night. Our hearts and prayers are with the families and friends who lost loved ones last night, as well as the brave first responders who are still on the scene. I'd like to ask everyone to join us in a moment of silent prayer and reflection for the souls lost. Thank you. Next, I want to remind everyone in attendance here that while you are all welcome to observe today's hearing, I will not allow or tolerate disruptions from the audience. Audience members may not verbally or physically distract from the hearing, including by shouting, standing, raising signs, or making gestures that block the view of other members of the audience or the cameras for those watching on television or online. Anyone who does so will be removed immediately by the Capitol Police and banned from return. Welcome everyone to this hearing on President Trump's nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. Ms. Gabbard, welcome to the Senate Intelligence Committee. I also want to welcome your family in attendance today, including your husband, Abraham, your mother, Carol, and your sister, friend Dobbin. I also want to acknowledge some very special friends of yours, Dakota Myers and Pat Payne, both Medal of Honor recipients. Gentlemen, on behalf of the grateful nation, I extend my deepest thanks to you and the heroes with whom you served. I also note that our next Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is joining us. Apparently, she didn't have enough fun at her own confirmation hearing. Ms. Bondi, welcome and congratulations. And finally, Senator Joni Ernst and former Senator and Chairman of this committee, Richard Burr, will introduce Ms. Gabbard shortly. We look forward to your remarks. I think it's fair to say that Ms. Gabbard's nomination has generated a bit more interest and attention than do most nominees before this committee. But I want to stress that Ms. Gabbard has been and will be treated with the exact same respect, consideration, and professionalism that we extended to every nominee. No more, no less, no better, no worse. That's how we treated CIA Director John Ratcliffe just 2 weeks ago, and how we have treated DNI nominees like Avril Haines and Dan Coates in the past. For instance, Ms. Gabbard has conducted dozens of office meetings with senators. She has completed the committee's standard questionnaire. She has answered 247 questions in writing. This is all in keeping with the committee's customs, precedents, and rules. Before I address the important work ahead at the DNI, please also let me make two observations about some of the accusations about Ms. Gabbard. First, I'm dismayed by the attacks on Ms. Gabbard's patriotism and her loyalty to our country. For instance, Hillary Clinton has smeared Ms. Gabbard, calling her an asset of a foreign nation. Let me remind everyone that Ms. Gabbard has served in our Army for more than 2 decades. She has multiple combat tours, and she still wears the uniform to this day. She has undergone 5 FBI background checks. I spent more than 2 hours last week reviewing the latest, putting eyes on more than 300 pages. It's clean as a whistle. It's fine that we have differences of opinions on policies and programs. I suspect some of my Republican colleagues might disagree with some of Mrs. Gabbard's votes in the House of Representatives. Just as I suspect that some of my Democratic colleagues might criticize Ms. Gabbard's statements and actions since she saw the light and left the Democratic Party. But I sincerely hope that no one today will impugn Ms. Gabbard's patriotism and integrity. Second, I can only laugh at some critics who say that Ms. Gabbard has unconventional views. No doubt she has some unconventional views, like her criticism of Barack Obama's regime change interventions in Egypt and Libya. But guess what? I opposed the disastrous interventions in Egypt and Libya as well. Mubarak was a longtime American partner, and Egypt was a linchpin of our security system in the Middle East. Gaddafi had been scared straight after we toppled the Taliban and Saddam Hussein. He turned over his weapons of mass destruction and cooperated against terrorists. In return, we had lifted sanctions and reestablished diplomatic ties. But President Obama intervened to topple both regimes. And what came next? The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and dangerous chaos in Libya to this day. No one ever mistook Mubarak or Gaddafi as the little sisters of the poor. But let's not kid ourselves. The world is a dangerous place, not a church picnic. Ms. Gabbard understands this, which is why she also saw the problem with regime change interventions in these places. The vast number of governments throughout history and still today are not democratic. We may wish it were different and we can work to improve it, but that's the way the world is. If we only befriended nations that shared our system of government and our social and cultural sensibilities, well, we wouldn't have many friends. In a fallen world, we have to take our friends where we find them. No question, stable democracies make the most stable friends, but what matters in the end is less whether a country is democratic or non-democratic, and more whether the country is pro-American or anti-American. I'll confess that those views may be somewhat unconventional, but look at where conventional thinking has got us. Maybe Washington could use a little more unconventional thinking. And I'm sure that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence could use more unconventional thinking. Ms. Gabbard, I submit that if confirmed, the measure of your success will largely depend on whether you can return the ODNI to its original size, scope, and mission. When Congress created the ODNI, we intended to put one office in charge to manage the different agencies of the intelligence community. Congress intended the ODNI to be a very lean organization that would use small staffs to execute specific tasks. Congress in no way wanted yet another unruly bureaucracy layered on top of an already bureaucratic intelligence community. Unfortunately, 20 years later, that's exactly what the ODNI has become. Incredibly, the ODNI now is now larger than any agencies it was established to manage. It has 15 offices and centers, which have many subunits within them. The ODNI staff is measured in the thousands, when it should be measured in the dozens, or maybe a few hundred. I promise that's going to change. I intend to get personnel at the ODNI back to their home agencies doing real intelligence work, not bureaucratic make work. I also expect to cap the size of the ODNI. Ms. Gabbard, if confirmed, I hope you'll be a partner in these vital efforts. Another example of bureaucratic mission creep and empire building is what's come to be known in the intelligence community as DNI taxes. The ODNI levies these so-called taxes on other agencies, shifting and directing funds away from the intelligence community's core mission to the whims and fancies of any particular DNI. That practice, which seems to have grown and run rampant under Director Haynes, is also going to stop. Ms. Gabbard, if confirmed, you have a lot of work ahead of you. And as chairman of this committee, I'm committed to ensuring that we see it all the way through. At this moment, I'll now recognize Senator Risch for a brief statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I want to thank Ms. Gabbard for meeting with me and having the candid conversation we did on the issues. Unfortunately, I have to chair the Foreign Relations Committee. We have our first substantive meeting today on malign influence of China here at home and abroad. So I'm not going to be able to stay for the hearing. I'm not going to get a chance to ask questions. However, we are going to have a closed session immediately following, and the questions I have trespass upon the security of the country, and as a result of that, they need to be done in a classified setting in any event. So if I beg indulgence to be excused to preside over the other committee, good luck. I know you'll do well. Thank you.
You are excused.
I was going to lead whether you excuse me or not, but thank you very much.
I will now recognize the Vice Chairman, Senator Warner, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and particularly thank your comments at the top. I've spent most of the morning at a National Airport. I know Senator Moran was there last night. It's a horrible tragedy. The victims' families are still being notified. For those of us who live in this region, you know, it's always kind of complicated. We've got Virginia, DC, Maryland, and a host of local jurisdictions. But last night, when this tragedy took place, and I happened to be driving by National on the way home and saw all the first responders rushing to the scene. People came from as far away as Baltimore, Fairfax County. We had DOD and federal officials there. And these first responders, as always, ran towards the tragedy. There'll be a time to figure out what happened and how we rectify it. But today, our thoughts and prayers ought to be with the families, and again, thanking our first responders. Ms. Gabbard, welcome. And congratulations on your nomination to be the next Director of National Intelligence. I'd like to begin by thanking you, literally, for your decades of public service, both in uniform and as a member of Congress from Hawaii. I applaud your continuing commitment to serve should you be confirmed. Now, the President has nominated you to be Director of National Intelligence. Most folks probably don't understand the importance of this position. If confirmed, you would lead 18 agencies of the IC. You'll also serve as the principal advisor to the President, the National Security Council, and the Homeland Security Council for all intelligence matters related to national security. And in this role, you'll be responsible for over $100 billion between the National Intelligence Program and the Military Intelligence Program, or the NIP and the MIP as we call them here. It's a position of great importance and significance to our national security, created after one of our worst national security failures, 9/11. For that reason, when Congress established this position, thanks in large part to our colleague and our friend Susan Collins, it mandated in law that any individual nominated for this position must have, and I quote, extensive national security expertise. Now, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me, and as I noted in that office, both before and after, I continue to have significant concerns about your judgment and your qualifications to meet the standards set by law. First, as I noted previously, the DNI was created in part to make sure we had appropriate intelligence sharing, which prior to 9/11, obviously we haven't. But the mission also is to not only share information between the IC, but also with our allies. There's no legal requirement that our allies share intelligence with us. It's all predicated on trust. Trust that our allies will protect each other's secrets. It appears to me you have repeatedly excused our adversaries' worst actions, and instead often blame them on the United States and those very allies. For example, you blame NATO for Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. You rejected the conclusion that Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, despite it being the unanimous assessment of the then Trump administration's DOD, State Department, and IC, as well as the assessment of our European allies. Instead, you blame the United States for supporting terrorist groups in Syria. Now, I don't know if your intent in making those statements was to defend those dictators, or if you were simply unaware of the intelligence and how your statements would be perceived. In either case, it raises, at least for this senator, serious questions about your judgment. It also leads me to question whether you can develop the trust necessary to give our allies confidence that they can share their most sensitive intelligence with us. Make no mistake about it. If they stop sharing that intelligence, the United States will be less safe. We've seen this as recently as this past year, where because of those strong intelligence sharing between the United States and Austria, countless lives were saved by disrupting a terrorist attack that was going to take place at the Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. Second, you have been publicly outspoken in your praise and defense of Edward Snowden, someone who betrayed the trust of our nation and jeopardized the security of our country. The truth is, the vast majority of the information he stole and leaked before running off to China and Russia, might I add, had nothing to do with Americans' privacy and compromised our most important sources and methods. And in many ways, we're still paying a price for that. And I believe that Edward Snowden's action put our men and women in uniform in places like Iraq and Afghanistan at risk. You have celebrated Snowden as a, quote, brave whistleblower, and actually put forward legislation asking for his pardon. Furthermore, when given the opportunity to clarify your position in pre-hearing questions, you declined. And instead you expressed, and again, I quote, the DNI has no role in determining whether or not Edward Snowden is a lawful whistleblower. Well, that is troubling to me in so many ways. Not only do you think that someone who divulged secrets and then ran off to Russia should be celebrated as brave, but you don't seem to understand the DNI's role in determining whistleblower determinations. In fact, the DNI has a significant role in transmitting lawful whistleblower complaints to this committee. They're all laid out right here in the statute. And I would have serious concerns about confirming someone who cannot distinguish between complaints that are made lawfully and those that are made not. In the statute, it says the job of the DNI is to protect intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. That's a quote. I guess I'm asking, what message would it send to have a DNI who would celebrate the work of a member of the IC or a contractor that would, on their own mission, to decide what's appropriate to leak? I don't understand it. Third, until recently, you had a clear and consistent record of opposing FISA 702. I know members on this committee already understand how important this is, but for folks who don't, this law is critical to our national security. Literally 60% on average of what goes into the president's daily brief, what President Trump will read each day in assessing what's going on in the world, comes from this important piece of law that allows us to seek out those foreigners abroad for coverage. And it's helped prevent terrorist attacks. It helps us prevent foreign cyber attacks. It helps us on a topic that a lot of folks are looking at, fentanyl trafficking. Now, many in this Congress and many on the committee have tried to reform this legislation to better balance security and civil liberties. However, you have consistently gone further. Not only did you vote against reauthorizing 702, you actually introduced legislation to fully repeal the whole thing, calling it again, quote, a blatant disregard for our Fourth Amendment constitutional rights. Now, I understand that since you've been nominated to be DNI, you've expressed a change of heart. I think that's welcome, but I have to tell you, as I view this as a job interview, as I try to make my judgment on whether you should be confirmed, I don't find your change of heart credible. Because the world today is more complex and more dangerous than ever before. And we need serious people with sufficient experience to be able to navigate that complexity. I hope you use this opportunity to address my concerns and all of the members of this committee. I appreciate again your service, and I'm looking forward to a thorough discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. We welcome back Senator Richard Burr, the former chairman of this committee who has emerged from retirement, to introduce Ms. Gabbard. Yet still in retirement, he still seems unable to find a pair of socks. Nonetheless, we say thank you and welcome you back, Senator Burr.
Some things are very predictable, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman Cotton, Vice Chairman Warner, members of this distinguished committee, I want to thank you for allowing me to join you today to provide my thoughts and support on behalf of Tulsi Gabbard's nomination to be Director of National Intelligence. This is my first visit back to the Senate in slightly over 2 years. Permit me to say, from this side of the dais, you're not as intimidating as I thought when I was on your side of the dais. When I was chairman of this committee, Senator Warner and I stuck to a single refrain with our staff: follow the facts wherever they lead. Today, an anonymous person or group launching a campaign using rumors as sources and accusations as fact can drive the outcome of an election and of public opinion. I know it to be true. Remember, I sat in your chair for the Russia investigation, where we found much of the influence to be the result of fictitious narratives driven by Russia. Now, some of you may be wondering, why do I support Tulsi Gabbard and why am I here to introduce her as a nominee? I've experienced firsthand a coordinated attempt to influence this nominee's support in the United States Senate and with the American people. I was contacted by several national journalists shortly after the president nominated Tulsi, asking me to confirm one of the many rumors circulating about this nominee. I informed each journalist over a 5-week period that the rumors shared with me was simply not true. This narrative was shared from one journalist to the next journalist to the next journalist. I assume today they ran out of journalists. This was a coordinated effort to kill this nomination. Advise and consent is the responsibility of the United States Senate, and I truly believe that each member takes it seriously. All members of this committee were offered the opportunity for individual meetings with Tulsi, and if you chose not to meet with her, it's on you. I've done my homework, and here are the facts. Tulsi Gabbard's historic life began at birth. She's the first American Samoan-born member of Congress, period. She graduated from Hawaii Pacific University with a degree in business administration with a concentration in international business. In 2002, at age 21, Tulsi became the youngest woman in America ever elected as a state representative. That was not enough. In 2003, she joined the Hawaii National Guard. When deployed, in her re-election, her opponent raised the issue, could you serve the people that elected you if in fact